They called her Euphemia Barron, the mistress of a Georgia plantation, a woman whose size was matched only by her cruelty. On her birthday, her husband Ambrose Barron placed a man before her as a gift. His name was Solomon. Silent, strong, watchful. Euphemia mocked him, used him like furniture, forced him to sing while she feasted. She believed he was powerless. But Solomon carried something she could never see, a patience as sharp as a blade. When the storm came and her own weight broke the beams above the cellar, the legend was born. Some called it an accident, others whispered divine punishment. But that night was only the beginning. Because once Solomon tasted the power of turning cruelty back on its master, the whole plantation would tremble. This is not just a story of revenge. It's a story of fear turned inside out, where the hunted becomes the hunter. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Morning light spilled across barren plantation, painting the white columns of the main house golden. The air hung heavy with summer heat, though the day had barely begun. Inside the grand dining room, Euphemia Barron sat at the head of the breakfast table, her massive form nearly spilling over the reinforced chair specially built to hold her weight. Her face, though once perhaps pretty in youth, had grown puffy and red with years of excess. "It's my birthday, Ambrose," she said, stabbing a fork into a stack of syrup-drenched hotcakes. "What have you brought me this?" Ambrose Barron stood near the window, tall and rigid in his tailored suit. His face remained carefully blank, hiding his distaste as he watched his wife devour her meal. "Patience, my dear. Your gift awaits outside." Overseer Crenshaw lingered in the doorway, his weathered face twisted in a half-smile. The leather whip hung at his side, his fingers tapping against the handle as if eager for use. "Well?" Euphemia demanded, not bothering to finish chewing. "Don't make me wait, husband. I've been patient enough." Ambrose nodded to Crenshaw, who disappeared from the doorway. The overseer returned moments later, shoving a tall black man ahead of him. The newcomer kept his eyes lowered. His body held perfectly still despite Crenshaw's rough handling. "This is Solomon," Ambrose announced with a proud gesture, as if displaying a prized horse. "Strong as an ox, from the Wilson plantation. They say he's good with his hands and learns quick. I paid a pretty penny for him." Euphemia's small eyes widened with interest. She wiped her greasy chin with a napkin and leaned forward, studying Solomon like a curious, dangerous child, examining an insect. "Come closer," she commanded. Solomon took 3 measured steps forward, his face a careful mask. Only someone watching very closely might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders. He was tall and powerfully built, with broad shoulders and strong hands. His clothes were the rough cotton given to field hands, but they couldn't hide the dignity in his bearing. "Look at me," Euphemia ordered. Solomon raised his eyes slowly. They were dark and calm, revealing nothing. Euphemia laughed suddenly, a harsh sound without humor. "He's got a proud look to him, doesn't he? We'll fix that." She turned to her husband. "A man for my birthday, Ambrose? How thoughtful of you to remember I needed a new servant." "He'll attend to whatever you require," Ambrose replied. "He came highly recommended for his obedience." Crenshaw snorted quietly from his position by the door. "Any troubles, ma'am? You just call for me. I got ways of teaching respect." Euphemia waved a plump hand dismissively. "I can handle my own servants, Crenshaw." She turned her attention back to Solomon. "Can you sing, boy?" Solomon nodded once. "Yes, mistress." "Good. I like music with my meals." She pointed to a spot beside her chair. "Stand there and sing me something while I finish eating. A hymn, perhaps. Do you know Amazing Grace?" "Yes, mistress." "Then sing it. Now." Solomon moved to the spot she indicated and began to sing. His voice was deep and clear, filling the room with sound. The words of grace and salvation took on a strange, almost mocking quality in this setting, though his face remained carefully blank. Euphemia smiled, clearly pleased with her new toy. She resumed eating, occasionally pausing to correct Solomon's posture or demand he sing louder. Once, she reached out with a greasy hand and pinched his arm hard enough to bruise. "Too skinny," she declared. "Though I suppose that's good. The last one was too heavy for the stairs." She laughed at her own joke, crumbs falling from her mouth. Solomon's singing never faltered, but for just a moment something flashed in his eyes, a spark quickly hidden. He watched everything, the layout of the room, how Ambrose stiffened at his wife's cruelty, how Crenshaw's hand never left his whip, the way the floorboards creaked under Euphemia's chair. By midday, Solomon had learned the bitter rhythm of his new position. Euphemia called for him constantly, making him fetch her fans, books she never read, and sweets she devoured while forcing him to recite prayers. She mocked his height, his hands, the way he spoke, finding fault with everything while demanding perfect service. When afternoon storms darkened the sky, Euphemia sat in the parlor, forcing Solomon to stand motionless, as she described in excruciating detail how her previous servants had disappointed her and the punishments they'd received. "The last one died," she said casually, popping a candied fruit into her mouth. "Fever took him after a whipping. Shame. He was almost properly trained." Solomon said nothing, but his eyes recorded everything: the weak spots in the floorboards, the distance to each door, the weight of the silver candlesticks on the mantel. Night fell with the storm still raging. Euphemia, having consumed enough food and brandy to fell a smaller person, attempted to rise from her chair in the sitting room. Her legs, swollen and weak, buckled beneath her. "Solomon!" she shouted, face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Come here this instant!" He appeared in the doorway, silent and watchful. "My legs are troubling me tonight," she said, her voice slurring slightly from the brandy. "You'll carry me upstairs to my room." Solomon's face remained perfectly still as he stepped forward to obey his mistress's command. Solomon bent at the knees and slid his arms beneath Euphemia's massive body. His face remained neutral, though his muscles tensed visibly as he braced himself. Lifting her was like trying to hoist a wet mattress, unwieldy and dangerously heavy. "What's the matter, boy?" Euphemia taunted as he struggled to stand upright with her weight. "Aren't you supposed to be strong as an ox? That's what my husband paid for." Solomon's breath came in controlled bursts as he steadied himself. "Yes, mistress," he managed, adjusting his grip. "Well, you're not impressing me," she said, her breath hot with brandy. She pinched his shoulder hard. "Move faster." The first step on the staircase creaked loudly under their combined weight. Solomon paused, feeling the wood give slightly beneath his foot. His eyes flickered downward, noting the worn state of the wood, the slight separation between the riser and the wall. "Did I tell you to stop?" Euphemia barked. Solomon continued upward, each step deliberate. Halfway up, he felt a different kind of give. Not just the wood creaking, but a subtle shift in the support beneath. His keen eyes caught a hairline crack running along the joint where the staircase met the wall. "You're pathetically slow," Euphemia complained, her body growing heavier in his arms as she relaxed into his struggling. "The last boy could carry me up in half the time." "Sorry, mistress," Solomon said quietly, his eyes still cataloging every weakness in the structure. When they finally reached the top, sweat soaked through Solomon's shirt. Euphemia laughed at his discomfort as he carried her to her bedroom, a lavishly decorated chamber with a reinforced bed frame. "Put me down gently, boy," she ordered, "and mind my nightclothes are laid out properly." Solomon set her down and stepped back, his breathing carefully controlled despite the strain. His eyes swept the room, taking inventory just as he had downstairs. The distance between furniture, the height of the window, the thickness of the rugs. "Tomorrow," Euphemia said, settling herself against the pillows. "You'll learn your full duties. I expect perfect service." Her smile turned cruel. "And when you fail, because you will fail, Crenshaw will teach you to do better." The next week unfolded like a nightmare. Euphemia found endless ways to use Solomon's body and dignity as objects for her amusement. On Tuesday, she forced him to kneel on all fours beside her chair for hours, using his back as a footrest while she ate pastries and complained about the heat. When her leg grew heavy on his spine, Solomon shifted slightly to redistribute the weight. "Did I give you permission to move?" she snapped, pressing her heel harder against him. "No, mistress. I apologize." She reached for a small bell on the table beside her and rang it sharply. Moments later, Crenshaw appeared in the doorway. "The new one needs a reminder about stillness," she said casually. Crenshaw's face split into an eager grin. "Happy to provide one, ma'am." Solomon received 5 lashes in the yard, not enough to seriously injure, but sufficient to leave burning welts across his back. Throughout, his expression remained distant, as if cataloging the pain rather than experiencing it. Ambrose watched from the porch, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his face troubled but silent. On Wednesday, Euphemia ordered Solomon to stand in the corner of the dining room during lunch, singing hymns without stopping. When his voice grew hoarse after 2 hours, she had Crenshaw force vinegar down his throat. "To strengthen your voice," she explained with a smile, "I won't tolerate weakness in my servants." Thursday brought rain, which leaked through a corner of the dining room ceiling. Solomon noticed the dampness spreading along the wood, the slight sag in the beams above. While cleaning the puddle beneath, he pressed his fingers against the floorboards, feeling how they had softened from repeated water damp. Friday was worst of all. Euphemia had Solomon carry her from room to room as she inspected the house, criticizing the work of the other enslaved people while adding her complaints about Solomon's bony shoulder and clumsy gait. When they passed Ambrose in the hallway, he frowned. "Euphemia, perhaps you shouldn't—" "Shouldn't what?" she challenged, her voice sharpening. "Enjoy my birthday gift as I see fit?" Ambrose's frown deepened, but he stepped aside. "As you wish." That evening, Solomon was sent to clean the cellar, a dark, musty space beneath the kitchen where barrels of sugar, flour, and preserved goods were stored. The ceiling was low, forcing him to duck his head. Support beams ran at intervals, many showing signs of water damage and age. Solomon ran his hands along one particularly concerning beam, testing its give. The wood felt soft in places, eaten away by time and moisture. Above, he could hear the heavy footfalls as Euphemia moved through the kitchen, the floor creaking ominously under her weight. His exploration was interrupted by Crenshaw's harsh voice from the cellar stairs. "Boy, mistress wants you upstairs now." When Solomon returned to the main floor, he found Euphemia seated at the kitchen table, surrounded by empty plates. Outside, distant thunder rumbled. "Solomon," she said, his name sounding wrong in her mouth, "there's a storm coming, and I want my special sweets before it arrives." "Yes, mistress." "There are barrels of sugar in the cellar," she continued, her eyes gleaming with malice. "The good imported kind, not that common brown stuff. Bring up the one marked with the blue seal. It's heavy, but that shouldn't trouble a strong man like you." She laughed, the sound like wet cloth tearing. "After all, what good are you if not for your usefulness?" Solomon nodded once, his eyes briefly drifting to the floorboards beneath her chair, where he could see the subtle bow in the wood, then to the cellar door with its worn hinges. "Right away, mistress," he said, turning toward the cellar stairs as the first heavy drops of rain began to pelt the windows. The storm arrived with a fury that shook the plantation house. Rain hammered against the windows like thrown pebbles, and thunder cracked overhead. making the chandeliers tremble. Candlelight flickered across the dining room where Euphemia sat finishing her evening meal, her face flushed from too much wine. Solomon stood silently against the wall, his tall frame casting a long shadow. The house servants moved quickly around the table, clearing dishes, their eyes downcast, shoulders hunched. They worked with the quiet efficiency of people who wished to remain invisible. Euphemia dabbed at her mouth with a napkin, then pushed back her chair with effort. The wooden legs scraped against the floor. She tried to stand but wobbled, her balance compromised by drink and her own bulk. "Solomon!" she called, her voice carrying over the storm's noise. "Come here!" He stepped forward, his face carefully blank. "I find myself tired after such a meal," she announced. "You will carry me upstairs." The other servants exchanged quick glances before hurrying to finish their tasks. They had witnessed this ritual before and wanted no part of it. "Yes, mistress," Solomon said. Euphemia smirked at the house servants. "Watch closely. This is how you train the stubborn ones." She raised her voice. "Lift me properly this time. Yesterday you nearly dropped me." Solomon positioned himself beside her chair and bent at the knees. As he slid his arms beneath her, Euphemia suddenly grabbed his ear and twisted. "Don't you dare breathe your slave stink on me," she hissed. The servants kept their eyes down, but their hands trembled as they stacked plates. One young woman nearly dropped a glass. Solomon lifted Euphemia with careful deliberation. Her weight strained his muscles, making the barely healed welts on his back burn. He took one step, then another, moving toward the staircase. "Martha, look at how he struggles," Euphemia called to one of the older servants. "Pathetic, isn't it? My husband paid good money for what he claimed was prime stock." Martha nodded quickly, not looking up. "Yes, mistress." The first step creaked loudly under their combined weight. Solomon paused, feeling the wood shift beneath his foot. The storm intensified, a crack of lightning illuminating the hallway through the windows. "Faster!" Euphemia demanded, pinching his shoulder. "I want my bed before Christmas." Solomon continued upward, each step more labored than the last. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air. 3 steps up, then 4. The servants watched from below, fear and pity in their eyes. At the 5th step, Solomon faltered. His foot slipped slightly, and Euphemia's body shifted in his arms. "Clumsy fool!" she spat. Solomon regained his balance, but now Euphemia was squirming, making herself harder to hold. They reached the halfway point of the staircase when Solomon's foot caught on the edge of a step. This time, the stumble was calculated. Solomon bent forward, as if trying to catch himself, causing Euphemia to tip backward. Her hands clutched at his shirt, tearing the fabric, as her weight pulled her in the opposite direction. "What are you?" she began, but her words turned to a scream as she fell backward. Solomon straightened, watching with steady eyes as Euphemia tumbled down the few stairs they had climbed. Her massive body gained momentum, crashing against the cellar door at the bottom of the staircase. The wood, weakened by years of moisture and neglect, splintered under the impact. With a terrible cracking sound, the door gave way completely. Euphemia's scream echoed as she fell into the darkness below. The sound cut off with a sickening thud, followed by multiple crashes as barrels toppled from their shelves. "Mistress!" Martha cried, rushing forward with the other servants. Solomon descended the stairs slowly, his face unreadable. The servants crowded around the broken doorway, peering down into the dim cellar. Lightning flashed again, briefly illuminating the scene below. Euphemia lay sprawled on the dirt floor, barrels of sugar and flour scattered around and on top of her. One massive barrel pinned her chest, while another had burst open, covering her face and hair with white powder. Blood pooled beneath her head, nearly black in the poor light. "Help her!" Martha shouted, looking frantically at Solomon. Solomon approached the cellar entrance, but made no move to descend. Instead, he began to hum softly, the same hymn Euphemia had forced him to sing while she ate. The melody rose above the storm's noise, filling the suddenly quiet hallway. "She's still breathing," one servant whispered, pointing to the slight movement of Euphemia's chest. Euphemia's eyes fluttered open, clouded with pain and confusion. She tried to speak, but only a gurgling sound emerged. Her gaze found Solomon standing above, still humming her hymn. For a moment, their eyes locked, hers filled with dawning horror, his with quiet observation. Then Solomon turned and walked away, his humming fading as he moved down the hallway. "Get Master Baron," Martha ordered one of the younger servants, who ran toward Ambrose's study. Minutes later, Ambrose burst into the hallway, Overseer Crenshaw close behind. Both men froze at the sight of the shattered cellar door. "Dear God!" Ambrose whispered, pushing past the servants to look down. Euphemia. He scrambled down the broken steps, Crenshaw following. They worked frantically to remove the barrels, but by the time they reached her, Euphemia's eyes had gone vacant, her body still. "What happened?" Ambrose demanded, looking up at the gathered servants. Martha stepped forward, wringing her hands. She asked Solomon to carry her upstairs, Master. She fell. The door broke. An accident," another servant added quickly. Crenshaw emerged from the cellar, his face grim. "She's gone, sir." Ambrose remained kneeling beside his wife's body, his expression moving from shock to grief to something harder. He looked up, scanning the servants' faces. "Where is Solomon?" "He went to get help," Martha lied, her voice barely steady. Ambrose climbed the broken stairs, his clothes smeared with flour and his wife's blood. He found Solomon in the kitchen, calmly wiping his hands on a cloth. "You," Ambrose said, his voice low and dangerous. "What did you do?" Solomon turned, his face showing appropriate concern. "I tried to carry her as she asked, Master. She was unsteady. I couldn't hold her." Crenshaw appeared behind Ambrose, his hand moving to the whip at his belt. "Let me deal with him, sir." Ambrose held up his hand, stopping the overseer. His eyes never left Solomon's face. "No, this was a tragic accident." "That's what we'll tell everyone." "Sir?" Crenshaw questioned. "She slipped," Ambrose said firmly. "That's what happened. She slipped during the storm and fell. Is that clear?" He addressed this to everyone in earshot. The servants nodded quickly. Ambrose stepped closer to Solomon, lowering his voice. "You will remain in my service, not as a gift anymore, but as my personal project." Gray morning light filtered through rain-streaked windows as the household gathered in the barren plantation's small chapel. The storm had passed, but its remnants hung in the air, a heavy dampness that clung to skin and clothing like grief. Ambrose Barron stood at the front, his black suit crisp despite the humidity, his face a mask of appropriate sorrow. Behind him, a portrait of Euphemia had been hastily placed on an easel, draped with black cloth. Candles flickered in wall sconces, casting long shadows across the wooden pews, where house servants sat rigidly on one side, separated from the handful of neighboring planters who had arrived for the hastily arranged prayer service. "We gather today," Ambrose began, his voice steady, "to mourn the tragic accident that took my beloved wife." Solomon stood at the back, positioned where Ambrose could see him. His face remained carefully blank, but his eyes missed nothing. Not the way Ambrose's hands trembled slightly, nor how Overseer Crenshaw kept glancing his way. "Euphemia slipped during last night's storm," Ambrose continued. "The cellar door gave way. By the time help arrived, she had already passed to her reward." A few of the neighboring wives dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The house servants stared straight ahead, their expressions revealing nothing. The plantation minister, a thin man with watery eyes, stepped forward to read scripture. His words droned on about the fragility of life and God's mysterious ways. Throughout the service, Solomon felt Crenshaw's gaze boring into him. When the final prayer ended, the neighbors moved to offer Ambrose their condolences. Crenshaw seized the opportunity to approach Ambrose, leaning close to whisper in his ear. "That one had something to do with it," Crenshaw murmured, nodding toward Solomon. "I've seen the look in his eyes. Calculating. Dangerous." Ambrose's jaw tightened. "Mind your place, Crenshaw." "It was an accident." "Of course, sir," the overseer replied, not bothering to hide his skepticism. "Just saying what others might think. Slaves talk. They might get ideas." "Then ensure they don't," Ambrose snapped. "Double the work in the fields today. Keep them too busy for idle thoughts." Crenshaw nodded, a cruel smile playing at his lips. "As you wish, sir." He cast one more suspicious glance at Solomon before heading out to gather the field hands. The neighbors departed shortly after, leaving Ambrose alone with Solomon and the house servants. Ambrose dismissed the servants to their duties, but pointed at Solomon. "You, my study. Now." Solomon followed Ambrose down the hallway, passing the splintered cellar door that had been hastily nailed shut. Inside the book-lined study, Ambrose closed the door and poured himself a generous glass of whiskey. "Mr. Phillips, from the next plantation, offered to buy you this morning," Ambrose said without preamble. "He heard you were strong, offered good money." Solomon remained silent, his hands clasped behind his back. "I declined," Ambrose continued, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Do you know why?" "No, master," Solomon replied, his voice level. Ambrose drank deeply, then set his glass down with deliberate care. "Because I want you here, under my eye. My wife may have been fooled by your act of obedience, but I see through it." He stepped closer, his breath hot with whiskey. "Whatever curse or wickedness you carry, I will break it. You will remain in this house, serving me, until you truly understand your place." Solomon lowered his eyes. "Yes, master." "Get out," Ambrose hissed. "Report to Crenshaw in the fields. Tonight, you'll sleep in the kitchen. I want you where I can watch you." The sun beat down mercilessly as Solomon worked alongside the other enslaved people. Crenshaw had indeed doubled their workload, extending the day's labor well into the evening. Backs bent in the cotton rows, hands bleeding from the sharp bowls, voices kept low. "Heard the mistress fell down the cellar steps," an older man named Jeremiah whispered when Crenshaw rode to the far end of the field. Solomon nodded once, not looking up from his work. "The Lord works in mysterious ways." A young woman named Ruth glanced nervously toward Crenshaw before whispering, "They say you were there, that you were carrying her." Solomon straightened slightly, wincing at the pain in his shoulders. "The cruel are punished eventually," he said quietly. "Her weight broke the door that held her up, like her cruelty broke what held her soul up." The others exchanged looks, part fear, part wonder. "Master Baron seems mighty strange today," Jeremiah observed. "Watching you like you might sprout wings." "He knows," Ruth whispered. "He suspects it wasn't no accident." Solomon met her eyes briefly. "Sometimes justice finds its own path, even here." Word spread quickly through the quarters as the day progressed. By evening, Solomon had become the center of furtive glances and whispered conversations. Some avoided him, crossing to the other side of the field when he approached. Others drew closer, as if his presence offered protection against Crenshaw's whip. When dusk fell, Crenshaw ordered Solomon back to the main house while the others returned to their quarters. As Solomon passed the slave cabins, an old woman reached out to touch his arm. "You bring down the mighty," she murmured. "Been waiting for someone like you." Solomon gently removed her hand. "I'm just a man," he replied, but the look in his eyes said otherwise. In the kitchen, Solomon worked silently, washing dishes as a house servant named Martha prepared Ambrose's evening meal. From his seat in the dining room, Ambrose watched through the open door, barely touching his food. "He's been like that all day," Martha whispered when Ambrose finally retreated to his study. "Watching, waiting, like he thinks you'll disappear in smoke." Solomon dried his hands on a cloth. "Fear does strange things to a man." "What did you do to make him so afraid?" Martha asked, her voice barely audible. Solomon didn't answer, just continued with his work. Later that night, when the house fell quiet and Ambrose had finally retired to his bedroom, Solomon slipped out to the barn. The moonlight provided just enough illumination to see by as he retrieved a small knife he'd hidden beneath a loose floorboard weeks ago. Sitting on an upturned bucket, Solomon selected a piece of wood from his hidden cache. His hands moved with practiced skill, shaving away thin curls of wood. The knife flashed silver in the moonlight as he worked. Hours passed as the carving took shape. A rounded figure, unmistakably Euphemia, lying beneath small, carefully rendered barrels. Her face was detailed enough to recognize, her expression one of frozen surprise. When he finished, Solomon studied his work, turning it in his hands. Then he stood, reaching up to a beam that ran across the top of the barn. A small hollow had been carved there, invisible unless someone knew to look for it. Solomon slipped the figure into the hiding place, where it joined several others, carvings of plantation life, of punishment, of pain. His own secret record of all he had witnessed. The carving of Euphemia's death slid perfectly into place. Solomon ran his fingers over the beam one last time before returning to the house, his face once again a mask of quiet subservience. Behind him, in the darkness of the barn, the wooden Euphemia lay crushed beneath her wooden barrels, a small monument to a power shift that had only just begun. 3 days after the prayer service, Ambrose Barron paced the length of his study. The grandfather clock ticked loudly in the corner, marking the passing of another sleepless night. Outside, rain pattered against the windows, a gentle but persistent sound that had continued for days. Ambrose paused at his desk, pouring another glass of whiskey. His third tonight. The bottle was nearly empty. "Can't sleep again, sir?" The house servant, Martha, stood in the doorway with a candle. "What are you doing up at this hour?" Ambrose snapped. "Thought I heard something, sir, by the cellar." Ambrose's hand tightened around his glass. "What sort of something?" Martha hesitated. "Singing, sir, like a hymn." The whiskey sloshed over the rim as Ambrose set his glass down too hard. "Nonsense! You're hearing the wind." "Yes, sir." Martha's eyes lowered. "Would you like me to bring fresh candles?" "No." "Go back to bed." After she left, Ambrose moved to the window, staring out at the rain-soaked yard. Sleep had become his enemy since Euphemia's death. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind seemed to carry accusation. He was about to turn away when he noticed footprints in the mud below his window. Fresh ones, leading from the slave quarters toward the cellar door, then disappearing around the side of the house. The whiskey glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor. Morning brought no relief. Ambrose stood in the yard, studying the footprints that hadn't been washed away by the night's rain. They were large, a man's prints, heading directly to the now-repaired cellar door. "Crenshaw!" he called. The overseer appeared from the direction of the stables, his whip already in hand. "Yes, sir?" Ambrose pointed at the footprints. "Someone was walking here last night." "Find out who." Crenshaw crouched, examining the muddy impressions. "Too big for most of the house servants." His eyes narrowed. "About Solomon's size, I'd say." "Find him. Bring him to me. He's working the north field today. I'll fetch him." Solomon was hoeing a row of young cotton plants when Crenshaw rode up. Without a word, the overseer dismounted and grabbed Solomon by the collar, dragging him toward his horse. "Master wants to see you," Crenshaw growled. "Move!" The other field hands watched silently as Solomon was marched away. As soon as Crenshaw was out of sight, whispers erupted. "He's done for now," a young man muttered. Ruth shook her head. "No, Master won't touch him. Solomon's got protection. What protection? Ruth glanced toward the main house. The same that brought down the mistress. You'll see. Ambrose was waiting on the porch when Crenshaw arrived with Solomon. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy with humidity. "Show him the footprints," Ambrose ordered. Crenshaw shoved Solomon toward the muddy ground near the cellar door. "These yours?" Solomon studied the footprints silently. "Answer him!" Crenshaw raised his whip. "No, master," Solomon said quietly. "I was in the kitchen last night. Martha can tell you. I slept there as you ordered." Ambrose's face flushed. "Martha said she heard singing by the cellar. Was that you too?" "No, master." "I don't sing anymore." Something in Solomon's tone made Ambrose step back. The quiet certainty in his voice carried an unsettling weight. "Get back to the fields," Ambrose finally said. "Crenshaw, double the guard tonight. Anyone caught outside their quarters gets 10 lashes." As Solomon turned to leave, Ambrose called after him. "And, Solomon, I'll be watching you personally." Solomon nodded once, his face unreadable. That night, Crenshaw made good on Ambrose's orders. The lash fell heavily across Jeremiah's back when he was caught returning late from the outhouse. Ruth received 5 strokes for whispering after dark. 3 others were punished for minor infractions. But the next morning, more footprints appeared, this time circling the entire house, pausing longest outside Ambrose's bedroom window. And the hymns continued. Not every night, but often enough that the house servants began to whisper that Euphemia's spirit walked the grounds, seeking vengeance for her accident. "I heard it clear as day," the cook told Martha as they prepared breakfast. "Same hymn she made poor Solomon sing while she ate. Amazing grace, but slow-like, mournful." Solomon, working quietly at the wash basin, said nothing, but his eyes watched everything. Ambrose's growing agitation, the servants' whispered fears, Crenshaw's increasing frustration. On the 7th night after Euphemia's death, a storm rolled in, more violent than the one that had taken her life. Lightning split the sky, and thunder shook the window panes of the main house. Solomon moved through the darkness with practiced stealth. The guards Crenshaw had posted were huddled under the stable overhang, more concerned with staying dry than watching for movement. The storage barn where cotton bales awaited shipment stood unguarded. Inside, Solomon worked quickly, adjusting a lantern so it hung precariously above the driest bales. One good gust through the open door would be enough. He slipped out and was halfway back to the house when the wind rose sharply. Behind him, there was a crash, then the first flicker of orange light as flame caught the cotton. By the time the alarm was raised, the fire had already consumed half the barn. Men rushed from the quarters with buckets, forming a line to the well. Ambrose and Crenshaw shouted orders, their faces lit by the dancing flames. "Save what you can!" Ambrose bellowed over the storm. That shipment was promised to Charleston by month's end. But the rain and wind worked against them. For every bucket thrown, the flames seemed to leap higher, as if fueled rather than dampened by the storm. Standing in the bucket line, Solomon passed water mechanically, his face expressionless. When Crenshaw stumbled past, Solomon heard him muttering, "It's not natural. Same night as last week's storm. Same time. It's a curse, I tell you." Other overseers took up the whisper. By morning, when the barn was nothing but smoldering ruins, the word curse had spread throughout the plantation. Ambrose didn't sleep that night. He stood at his bedroom window, watching the last embers of his cotton shipment glow in the rain. The financial loss was significant, but it was the timing that unnerved him most. 1 week exactly since Euphemia's death, during another storm, with hymns echoing in the night. Dawn broke gray and cheerless. Ambrose dressed without assistance, his movements stiff with exhaustion and rage. He strode across the muddy yard toward the slave quarters, ignoring the startled looks from the field hands preparing for the day's work. He kicked open the door to the men's cabin. Inside, 8 men scrambled to their feet, eyes lowered respectfully. All except Solomon, who knelt beside his pallet, head bowed as if in prayer. "Everyone out," Ambrose ordered. "Except him." The others filed out quickly, casting nervous glances at Solomon. When the door closed, Ambrose stood silent for a long moment, watching the kneeling man. "Look at me," he finally said. Solomon raised his head slowly. His eyes, when they met Ambrose's, held no fear, only a steady, measuring gaze that seemed to see through the plantation master. Ambrose opened his mouth to accuse, to threaten, to assert his authority, but the words died in his throat. There was something in Solomon's eyes, not defiance exactly, but a certainty that shook Ambrose to his core. "What are you?" Ambrose whispered. Solomon remained silent, kneeling in the dirt, his gaze unwavering. Ambrose backed toward the door, his hand finding the rough wood behind him. Without another word, he turned and fled, the early morning light catching the sweat that had broken out across his forehead. Behind him, still kneeling in the silent cabin, Solomon's lips curved into the faintest smile. Crenshaw limped across the barnyard, his face twisted in concentration. 3 nights of footprints and ghostly hymns had worn his patience thin. Worse still was Ambrose's growing madness. The master had taken to drinking before noon, muttering about curses and judgment. "I'll catch him tonight," Crenshaw muttered, checking the pit he'd spent the afternoon digging. Cleverly hidden beneath thin boards and a scattering of hay, the trap waited just outside the new storage barn where the remaining cotton bales were kept. He'd positioned it perfectly, right where those mysterious footprints appeared each morning, 4 feet deep, lined with sharpened sticks. Not enough to kill, but enough to hold a man until morning. Enough to prove Solomon was behind the strange happenings. "Simple nigger magic," Crenshaw spat, covering the last corner with straw. "We'll see how cursed you are with broken legs." As darkness fell, Crenshaw concealed himself behind stacked lumber, clutching his rifle. A flask of whiskey kept him company as the hours crawled by. Occasionally, he'd take a swig, grimacing at the burn. The moon rose, casting long shadows across the yard. From his hiding spot, Crenshaw could see the slave quarters, now dark and silent under Ambrose's curfew. The main house stood like a hulking beast against the night sky, a single candle burning in Ambrose's study. Midnight came and went. Crenshaw's eyes grew heavy. A sound startled him awake, a soft hymn floating on the night air. The same one the house servants whispered about. Amazing grace, but slow and mournful. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Crenshaw gripped his rifle tighter, scanning the yard. The singing stopped as suddenly as it had begun. "Show yourself!" he hissed into the darkness. Something moved near the cotton barn, a shadow shifting against shadows. Crenshaw rose, moving carefully toward his trap, rifle raised. "Got you now," he whispered, stepping forward. The ground gave way beneath him with a sickening crack. Boards splintered, and Crenshaw plunged downward, a scream tearing from his throat as pain shot through his leg. He landed hard, the sharpened sticks grazing his thigh and calf. "Help!" he shouted, panic rising in his chest. "Help me!" But the yard remained silent. The pain in his leg throbbed with each heartbeat, and when he touched it, his hand came away wet with blood. He tried to stand, using his rifle as support, but his leg crumpled beneath him. The pit was deeper than he remembered digging, nearly 6 feet now, the sides too steep to climb with an injured leg. "Someone!" he called again, voice cracking. "I'm trapped out here." From somewhere in the darkness, he thought he heard soft laughter. Dawn broke with shouts of alarm. 2 field hands discovered Crenshaw in the pit, pale from blood loss and night chills. His leg bent at an unnatural angle, the bone clearly broken. Ambrose arrived as they pulled the overseer from the hole, his face haggard from another sleepless night. "What happened?" he demanded. Crenshaw's eyes darted wildly. Trap! I set a trap for him. But it was deeper than I dug it. Someone changed it. For who? Ambrose asked, though he already knew the answer. Solomon, Crenshaw hissed through clenched teeth. But he knew. Somehow, he knew. Field hands carried Crenshaw to the overseer's cabin, while Ambrose stared at the pit. It was indeed deeper than a man could dig in an afternoon alone. The sides were smooth, the bottom lined with sharpened sticks that resembled fangs in the morning light. Who helped him dig this? Ambrose asked the gathered slaves. Eyes lowered, no one spoke. I asked a question. Ambrose's voice rose to a shout. Ruth, an older woman who worked in the kitchens, finally spoke. Nobody helped Crenshaw, Master. He did it alone. We all saw him. Not Crenshaw. Who deepened it afterward? Ruth met his gaze steadily. Nobody touched it after he finished, Master. We was all locked in quarters after sundown, like you ordered. Ambrose looked at the faces around him. Unreadable, cautious, but something else lingered in their eyes. A quiet satisfaction. He turned away, sickened by what he saw. Get back to work, all of you. As the crowd dispersed, Ambrose caught sight of Solomon, standing apart from the others. Their eyes met across the yard, and Solomon nodded once, a gesture so slight it might have been imagined. Word of Crenshaw's accident spread quickly through the quarters. That evening, as the enslaved gathered for their meager supper, the mood was lighter than it had been in weeks. Did you see his face when they pulled him out? Jeremiah whispered, a rare smile crossing his features. White as cotton, scared as a rabbit. Hush, Ruth warned, though her eyes danced. Walls have ears. But the whispers continued. In the men's cabin, huddled around a small fire, the talk turned to Solomon. They say Mistress Euphemia's ghost pushed Crenshaw into that pit. A young man named Isaac said, But I think it was Solomon's doing. Solomon was in the kitchen all night, another countered. Martha said he never left. Doesn't need to leave, Ruth said from the doorway, where she'd come to bring a salve for Jeremiah's healing lash wounds. Solomon's got protection. Spirit protection. The men fell silent as Solomon himself entered the cabin. He moved to his pallet without speaking, but the others watched him with new eyes, fearful, respectful, wondering. Later, when most had fallen asleep, Isaac crawled to Solomon's side. How'd you do it? He whispered. The pit, the footprints, the singing. Solomon studied the younger man. Some things don't need doing, he said quietly. They do themselves, when justice is due. Isaac's eyes widened. Then it's true? There's a curse. There's always been a curse on this place, Solomon replied. Just not the one they fear. In the main house, Ambrose poured his third glass of whiskey. The plantation doctor had set Crenshaw's leg, but the overseer would be bedridden for weeks, meaning Ambrose would need to manage the fields himself, or bring in another overseer, neither option appealing with the growing tension among the enslaved. It's getting worse, he muttered to himself, staring into the amber liquid. First Euphemia, now this. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Enter, he called. Martha appeared, her thin frame silhouetted against the hallway. Will you be wanting dinner, Master? No, Ambrose waved her away. Just leave the bottle. Yes, sir. She hesitated. Sir, the men are saying... I don't care what they're saying. Ambrose slammed his glass down. Get out! Martha fled, leaving Ambrose alone with his whiskey and fears. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Solomon slipped away from the quarters, moving silently through the shadows. The barn where he'd hidden his first carving beckoned. Inside, he found the loose beam easily, extracting a small knife he'd concealed there. Working by touch more than sight, Solomon began to carve, wood shavings falling like snow around his feet. His fingers shaped a man's figure, tall, thin, clutching a jug to his chest. The face took form under Solomon's knife. Ambrose's features, distorted by fear and drink, eyes wide with terror. When he finished, Solomon held the carving up, examining it in a shaft of moonlight that fell through a gap in the roof. A perfect likeness of the master, reduced to a frightened, drunken shell. Solomon smiled, then slipped the figure into the hollow beam alongside the carving of Euphemia. Two masters, both undone, preserved in wood, as a promise of what was to come. He replaced the beam covering and stepped back into the night, leaving no trace of his presence except for deliberate footprints leading directly to Ambrose's window. The morning after Crenshaw's accident, Ambrose rose before dawn. Sleep had eluded him again, his mind racing with whispers of curses and rebellion. He dressed quickly, his movements jerky with frustration, and headed toward Crenshaw's cabin. The overseer lay in bed, his legs splinted and bandaged. His normally ruddy face was pale, his eyes sunken with pain. "Get up," Ambrose ordered. "We're searching the barns." Crenshaw winced. "Sir, my leg? Use a crutch. I need your eyes." Ambrose threw open the cabin's small window. "Something's hidden in those barns. I can feel it." Half an hour later, Crenshaw hobbled beside Ambrose, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning chill. A rough wooden crutch supported his weight, each step drawing a hiss of pain through clenched teeth. "What exactly are we looking for, sir?" Crenshaw asked as they approached the first barn. "Proof," Ambrose replied. "Proof that Solomon is behind all this." The tobacco barn yielded nothing but dried leaves and empty crates. The equipment shed revealed only tools, neatly arranged as always. By midday, they had searched 4 buildings with nothing to show for their efforts. "The cotton barn is left," Crenshaw said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Though I don't see what we'd find there that ain't been found already." Ambrose didn't respond, pushing open the heavy doors. Inside, bales of cotton stood in neat rows, waiting for shipment. Dust motes danced in the light, streaming through cracks in the walls. "Check every corner," Ambrose ordered. "Every hiding place." They worked in silence, Crenshaw checking low places while Ambrose examined the higher shelves and beams. An hour passed with nothing unusual found. Frustrated, Ambrose kicked a wooden post. "There has to be something." The hollow sound that answered his kick made both men freeze. "That don't sound right," Crenshaw said, limping over. Ambrose ran his hands along the beam, feeling for irregularities. His fingers caught on a small notch near the top. He pressed it, and a section of the beam slid aside, revealing a hollow space within. "Hand me that stick," Ambrose said, pointing to a nearby pole. Using the stick, he fished inside the hollow. Something clattered onto the dirt floor. A small wooden figure. Ambrose bent to retrieve it, his breath catching in his throat. The carving was crude, but unmistakable. A fat woman trapped beneath barrels, her face frozen in a scream. "Euphemia! What in God's name?" Crenshaw whispered, peering over Ambrose's shoulder. Ambrose probed the hollow again. A second carving fell out, this one depicting a thin man clutching a jug, his features twisted in fear. The likeness to Ambrose himself was undeniable. "Witchcraft!" Crenshaw hissed, crossing himself. "Devil's work!" Ambrose's hands shook as he held the carvings. "This is no curse," he said, his voice deadly calm. "This is mockery. This is confession." He turned to Crenshaw, his eyes blazing. "Get everyone to the yard, everyone, and find me a whip." Solomon was tending the kitchen garden when the bell began to ring, the gathering bell, used only for plantation-wide announcements. His hands stilled in the soil, a cold dread settling in his stomach. Around him, others looked up, exchanging nervous glances. The bell continued its urgent clanging, echoing across the fields. "What's happening?" asked Martha, who had been picking herbs nearby. Solomon shook his head. "Nothing good." They joined the stream of people heading toward the central yard. Field hands arrived in groups, tools still in hand, confusion on their faces. House servants gathered in clusters, whispering anxiously. In the center of the yard stood a whipping post, rarely used since Euphemia's death, as Crenshaw preferred to deliver punishment on the spot. Today, it stood waiting, a long black whip coiled at its base. Ambrose appeared from the direction of the barns, Crenshaw limping beside him. In Ambrose's hand were two small objects that Solomon recognized instantly, his carvings. "Form a circle," Ambrose commanded, his voice carrying across the yard. "Everyone will witness this." The enslaved people reluctantly formed a wide ring around the post. Children were pushed to the back, but not sent away. Ambrose wanted all to see. "Solomon!" Ambrose called. "Step forward." For a moment, Solomon considered running. But where would he go? How far would he get before the dogs caught him? And what would happen to those left behind? Slowly, he stepped into the circle. Ambrose held up the carvings for all to see. "These were found hidden in the barn," he announced, "carved by the hands of this man, who has brought death and misfortune to this plantation." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some faces showed fear, others confusion. A few, those who had begun to believe in Solomon's power, looked betrayed. "These are not just carvings," Ambrose continued. "They are confessions, proof that my wife's death was no accident, but murder at the hands of this slave." He approached Solomon, holding the carving of Euphemia inches from his face. "Do you deny making this?" Solomon met his gaze steadily. "No, master." "And this one?" Ambrose thrust forward the carving of himself. "Is this a threat? A promise?" "It's just wood," Solomon replied quietly. Ambrose's face contorted with rage. "Tie him to the post," he ordered. Two field hands hesitated, then moved forward, avoiding Solomon's eyes as they bound his wrists to the post. Solomon didn't resist, allowing them to stretch his arms above his head, baring his back. Ambrose ripped Solomon's shirt open, exposing skin already marked with old scars, Euphemia's handiwork. 20 lashes, Ambrose announced, picking up the whip. Then, looking at his injured overseer, he added, "Crenshaw, you'll do the honors." A smile spread across Crenshaw's pain-lined face. He set aside his crutch and took the whip, testing its weight in his hand. "Count them," Ambrose instructed the assembled crowd. "Count them all." The first lash tore across Solomon's back with a crack that made several onlookers flinch. Solomon's body tensed, but he made no sound. "One," the crowd murmured reluctantly. Crenshaw drew back his arm again, putting his whole weight into the second strike despite his injured leg. Blood welled from the fresh wound. 2. By the fifth lash, Solomon's back was a mess of crisscrossing welts and open cuts. Still, he remained silent, his forehead pressed against the wooden post. By the 10th, his knees had buckled, his weight supported only by his bound wrists. Blood ran freely down his back, soaking into his tattered trousers. 11, the crowd counted, voices growing quieter. Crenshaw paused, breathing heavily from exertion and pain. Sweat poured down his face as he balanced on his good leg. "Continue," Ambrose ordered coldly. The whip rose and fell again, and again. Solomon's consciousness wavered, the world dimming around the edges. Yet still he made no sound, denying Ambrose the satisfaction of his screams. 20, came the final count, barely a whisper now. Solomon hung limp against the post, his back a ruined landscape of flesh. Ambrose stepped forward, grasping Solomon's hair to lift his face. "Let this be a lesson," he announced to the silent crowd. "There are no curses here, no magic, only the law of this plantation." He dropped Solomon's head and turned to the gathering. "Back to work, all of you." Slowly, the crowd dispersed, heads bowed, hope extinguished. The whispers of rebellion, of justice, seemed foolish now in the face of such brutal reality. Night fell on the barren plantation, bringing no relief from the day's heat. In the men's cabin, Solomon lay face down on his pallet, every breath sending waves of agony through his torn back. Ruth had cleaned his wounds as best she could, applying a poultice of herbs and wrapping his torso in strips of clean cloth. But infection was a near certainty, and death a possibility. The cabin was silent, save for the sound of breathing. No one spoke of what had happened. No one dared mention the carvings or the whipping. Fear had returned, heavier than before. Solomon drifted in and out of consciousness, fever beginning to cloud his thoughts. In lucid moments, he felt the full weight of his failure, his carefully laid plans, the slow building of fear and superstition, all undone by his own prideful mistake. The wooden figures, he should have burned them after carving, not kept them as trophies. His vanity had cost them all dearly. Near midnight, when all others slept, Solomon's cracked lips moved in the darkness. "This cannot be the end," he whispered to himself, the words barely audible. "Cannot be." He turned his face slightly, looking toward the small window where a sliver of moonlight cut through the darkness. Somewhere beyond that window lay the main house, where Ambrose would be sleeping, believing he had won. "This cannot be the end," Solomon repeated, his voice a thread of sound in the silent cabin. There must be another way. Dawn crept across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The plantation stirred to life as roosters crowed and work bells clanged in the distance. In the cramped cabin where Solomon lay, the air hung heavy with the smell of blood and herbal poultices. Solomon's eyes fluttered open, his throat parched beyond bearing. The fever that had gripped him through the night had broken sometime before dawn, leaving him weak but lucid. Each breath sent shards of pain across his lacerated back. The crude bandages Ruth had applied were stiff with dried blood. The cabin door creaked open, allowing a shaft of early morning light to slice through the dimness. Solomon tensed, expecting Crenshaw or one of his men coming to drag him back to work despite his injuries. Instead, a slender figure slipped inside. Abigail, who worked in the main house kitchen. She glanced nervously over her shoulder before hurrying to Solomon's side. "You awake?" she whispered, kneeling beside his pallet. Solomon managed a slight nod, unable to form words with his dry throat. Abigail pulled a small flask from beneath her apron. "Brought you water. Not much, but it's clean." With gentle hands, she lifted his head just enough to let the precious liquid trickle between his cracked lips. Solomon drank greedily, the cool water bringing immediate relief. "Slow," Abigail cautioned. "Too fast, and you'll just bring it back up." When he had drunk his fill, she reached into her pocket again and withdrew a cloth bundle. "Stole some cornbread and bacon from breakfast. Master Baron won't miss it. They're having a big meal up at the house." Solomon eyed the food, but made no move to take it. His arms felt leaden, his strength completely sapped by the whipping and subsequent fever. Understanding, Abigail broke off small pieces of the cornbread and fed them to him bit by bit. The simple food tasted like salvation. "Why risk this?" Solomon finally managed to ask, his voice a raspy whisper. Abigail's eyes darted to the door before answering. "Because you gave us something we ain't had in a long time. Hope." She paused, her voice dropping even lower. "Even if it's gone now." Solomon closed his eyes, shame washing over him. "I failed." "You tried," she countered. "That's more than most dare." After ensuring he had eaten as much as he could manage, Abigail reached into her apron one last time. This time, she withdrew a small handful of peach pits, their rough brown surfaces still flecked with bits of fruit flesh. "These might be useful," she said, placing them beside his pallet. "From the kitchen. Master Baron had them order crates of peaches for a special occasion." Solomon's brow furrowed in confusion. "Master Baron's hosting Euphemia's funeral feast next week," Abigail explained. "Delayed it because of the storm damage and cotton shipment. Now he's inviting all the county gentry to come pay respects." A cold clarity began to penetrate Solomon's pain-fogged mind. "A feast?" Abigail nodded. He was strutting around the house this morning like a rooster, saying how he's restored order after your whipping. Says everyone will see his strength at the funeral feast." Her voice took on a bitter edge. "He plans to have you serve at it too, once your back's healed enough to stand. Says it'll prove his complete victory." Solomon's fingers closed around the peach pits, feeling their weight. "Thank you, Abigail." She stood, brushing dust from her apron. "I have to get back before they notice I'm gone. I'll try to bring more food later." After she left, Solomon lay still, staring at the ceiling beams above him. His body screamed with pain, but his mind was suddenly terribly clear. The peach pits in his hand weren't just discarded kitchen waste. They were potential. They were power. 3 days passed before Solomon could stand without assistance. 5 before he could walk more than a few steps. All the while, the plantation continued its rhythms around him. Field hands departed at dawn and returned at dusk, exhausted. House servants came and went from the main house, carrying gossip and news. The funeral feast was set for Sunday, 6 days after Solomon's whipping. Preparations had begun in earnest. The best china unpacked, silver polished, tablecloths aired. Each night, when the others in his cabin fell into exhausted sleep, Solomon worked. With painful, deliberate movements, he took a peach pit and ground it against a flat stone he'd placed beneath his pallet. The work was slow and painstaking. His bandaged back protested each motion, fresh blood seeping through the cloth with every vigorous movement. But he persisted. Peach pits, he knew from stories passed down through generations, contained a secret. Crushed and ground to powder, they yielded a bitter substance that, in sufficient quantity, could stop a heart. His grandmother had warned of this when he was a child, cautioning him never to crack open the pits and eat what lay inside. Now, that childhood warning became his salvation. By the 4th night, Solomon had ground 3 pits to a fine powder, carefully collecting every speck in a scrap of cloth. It wasn't much, barely enough to fill the hollow of a spoon, but it would have to do. On the 5th day, Crenshaw came to the cabin to assess Solomon's recovery. "You'll serve at the funeral feast," he announced, prodding Solomon's back roughly with a stick. "Master Baron wants you there, visible. Wants everyone to see you've been put in your place." Solomon kept his eyes downcast, playing the part of the broken man. "Yes, overseer." Crenshaw seemed disappointed by Solomon's submission. He'd clearly hoped for resistance, an excuse to inflict more punishment. Finding none, he spat on the ground and left. That night, Solomon fashioned his final tool. Using a small knife borrowed from Ruth, he hollowed out the bowl of a wooden spoon, creating a secret compartment underneath that could hold his deadly powder. The craftsmanship was crude, but effective. When the spoon was turned upright, nothing seemed amiss. Only when turned over did the hidden hollow reveal itself. By lamplight, he carefully transferred the ground peach pit powder into the hollow, then sealed it with a thin slice of wood and pine sap. To the casual observer, it looked like any other serving spoon, perhaps a bit thicker in the handle than most. The night before the funeral feast, Solomon lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep. His back still throbbed with each heartbeat, but the pain had receded enough that he could function. Tomorrow, he would don the clean shirt Abigail had brought him. Tomorrow, he would stand straight despite the agony. Tomorrow, he would serve Ambrose Barron his last meal. In the quiet darkness, Solomon clutched the spoon tightly in his hand, feeling the weight of it, the weight of what it contained. "Soon," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the silent cabin. "Soon you'll drink your last toast, Master Baron." The moonlight filtered through the small window, illuminating Solomon's face, no longer twisted with pain, but set in grim determination. The look of a man who had found his second chance at justice. Lanterns swayed in the evening breeze, casting golden light across the whitewashed plantation house. The wide veranda, normally silent after sunset, bustled with activity as carriages arrived one after another, depositing Georgia's finest families in their funeral blacks and grays. Ladies in silk dresses with modest black ribbons climbed the steps, followed by gentlemen in tailored suits carrying silver-tipped canes. Solomon stood by the dining room entrance, dressed in a clean white shirt that rubbed painfully against his healing wounds. His face betrayed nothing as he watched the guests arrive, laughing and exchanging pleasantries as though attending a ball rather than a funeral feast. "Such a tragedy about poor Euphemia," said a plump woman as she handed her shawl to a house servant. "Though I hear she's lost considerable weight for the burial." Her companion tittered behind a black lace fan. "Elizabeth? How shocking!" Solomon's fingers tightened around the serving tray he held. The hollowed spoon rested among the silver cutlery, indistinguishable from the rest. Inside the dining room, candles blazed in silver holders along a table long enough to seat 20. Fine china gleamed, crystal glasses sparkled, and floral arrangements concealed the lingering smell of Euphemia's perfume that still haunted the house. Ambrose Barron stood at the head of the table, accepting condolences with practiced grace. He wore an expensive black suit with a silver watch chain across his vest. His face, flushed from pre-dinner drinks, showed more pride than grief. "Solomon," he called, noticing the tall figure in the doorway. "Don't stand there like a statue. Pour wine for our guests." Solomon moved forward with slow dignity, his back screaming with each step. He kept his eyes down as he filled glasses with deep red wine, navigating between guests who continued their conversations as though he were invisible. "I hear the cotton yield will be exceptional this year," said a gray-haired planter, accepting a glass without looking at Solomon. "Indeed," replied Ambrose, his voice carrying across the table. "Despite certain disruptions, order has been restored." His eyes flicked meaningfully toward Solomon, who showed no reaction. The dining room filled with chatter and the clink of silverware as the first course was served. Solomon moved silently along the table's edge, refilling glasses, removing empty plates, always watching Ambrose from the corner of his eye. Halfway through the meal, Ambrose's glass emptied for the third time. He was becoming louder, more boastful with each refill. "The key to managing one's property," he announced to the table, "is firm discipline, uncompromising authority." Solomon approached with the wine bottle. This was the moment. With practiced ease, he lifted Ambrose's crystal goblet, turning slightly away from the table as he did so. In that brief moment, shielded by his body, Solomon flipped the special spoon and pressed the hidden catch. The fine powder, pale as flour but deadly as nightshade, fell into the wine. Solomon stirred it once with the spoon's handle, watching it dissolve instantly in the dark liquid. "More wine, Master Baron," he said quietly, setting the goblet down. Ambrose barely acknowledged him, continuing his speech about property management to a captive audience. Solomon stepped back, his heart pounding beneath his calm exterior. Minutes passed, like hours. Solomon continued serving, his movements mechanical, while his eyes remained fixed on Ambrose's goblet. The plantation master drank deeply once, twice, emptying half the glass without pause. "And so," Ambrose said, his voice growing even louder, "I propose a toast." He stood, swaying slightly, and raised his poisoned glass. "To order restored and lessons learned." The guests raised their glasses. "To order restored," they echoed. Ambrose drained his glass in one long swallow, then smiled triumphantly at his guests. He opened his mouth to speak again, but stopped abruptly. A strange expression crossed his face. Confusion, then alarm. His hand flew to his throat. The empty goblet fell from his fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. "Ambrose?" asked the gray-haired planter. Are you unwell? Ambrose's face contorted. His lips, stained with wine, began turning an unnatural shade of blue. He gasped for air, clutching at his collar as though it were strangling him. "Help!" he wheezed, but the word was barely audible. His eyes, bulging with panic, locked onto Solomon's impassive face. In that moment of recognition, Solomon allowed himself a single, slight nod. Ambrose stumbled, knocking over his chair. He fell to his knees, still clawing at his throat, his face now a mottled purple. The dining room erupted into chaos. Women screamed. Men shouted for a doctor. Servants froze in horror. "He's been poisoned!" cried someone. "Witchcraft!" shrieked another. Solomon backed toward the door as guests swarmed around Ambrose, who had collapsed fully now, his body convulsing on the expensive carpet. No one noticed the tall servant slipping away. Outside, the commotion had spread like wildfire. House servants gathered in frightened clusters. Field hands emerged from their cabins, drawn by the screams echoing from the big house. "Master Baron's dying!" The news rippled through the quarter. Solomon moved swiftly despite his injuries, heading not toward his cabin but toward the edge of the property. Others began to follow his example, sensing opportunity in the chaos. A young field hand ran past Solomon, heading for the forest beyond the cotton fields. An older woman clutched her few possessions wrapped in a blanket. Children were hustled along by parents, suddenly seized with desperate courage. "Now!" someone shouted, "while they're busy with the master!" In the distance, a flicker of orange light caught Solomon's eye. Flames licked up the side of a cotton storage shed, growing rapidly in the dry night air. More fires bloomed across the plantation, the stable, the overseer's cabin, the edges of the cotton fields themselves. Solomon paused at the tree line, turning back to witness what he had set in motion. The grand house glowed with lantern light, still surrounded by the fine carriages of panicked guests. Beyond it, the ordered world of barren plantation dissolved into smoke and flame. All around him, dark figures moved through the night, scattering in every direction like seeds on the wind. Some headed for the swamps, where no hound could track them. Others ran for neighboring counties where they weren't known. The chains hadn't just been broken. They'd been forged into weapons. Thick smoke rolled across the plantation grounds, turning the night air into a choking fog. The grand white columns of the house disappeared behind curtains of gray as flames leaped higher from the cotton fields. Screams and shouts echoed through the darkness, mixing with the crack and roar of fire. Overseer Crenshaw stumbled out of his burning cabin, clutching a rifle in one hand and a leather bag in the other. His face was smeared with soot, his eyes wild with panic. He limped toward the stables, only to find them already engulfed in flames. "Cursed!" he shouted to no one in particular. "The whole place is cursed." His injured leg, never properly healed from the trap, gave way beneath him, and he fell to his knees in the dirt. Two house servants ran past him without stopping. Crenshaw raised his rifle but didn't fire. His hands shook too badly to aim. "It's that devil Solomon," he muttered, climbing back to his feet. "Brought his dark magic down on us all." Crenshaw spat on the ground and limped toward the road, abandoning the plantation as easily as he'd once abandoned his conscience. Near the main house, elegantly dressed guests fled in terror. Women hiked up expensive skirts to run through mud. Men forgot their dignified postures as they scrambled into carriages. Horses reared and neighed, frightened by the smell of smoke and the flash of flames. "Witchcraft!" cried the plump woman who had joked about Euphemia's weight. "First the mistress, now the master." "It's judgment," wheezed a thin man in clerical black. "Divine judgment on this place." Inside the dining room, Ambrose Barron lay still on the carpet, his face frozen in its final expression of horrified recognition. No one remained to close his eyes. Solomon moved like a shadow along the edge of the property, keeping to the trees. His white shirt was now stained gray with smoke, making him nearly invisible in the darkness. The leather pouch of coins he'd taken from Ambrose's study hung heavy against his side. Not payment for years of suffering. Nothing could pay that debt, but enough for what came next. Behind him, others followed. A dozen men and women who had seen in Solomon something worth believing in. They moved quietly, speaking only when necessary, carrying small bundles of possessions. "Which way?" whispered an older man named Jacob, who had worked the fields for 30 years. Solomon pointed north. "We cross the river at Willow Bend, then follow the North Star." A young woman carrying a sleeping child hurried to catch up. "Will they come after us?" she asked, fear making her voice tremble. Solomon looked back at the plantation. The big house still stood, but flames encircled it like a noose drawing tight. Dogs barked frantically from somewhere near the burning stables. "No," he said with quiet certainty. "Not tonight, and tomorrow will be too late." They reached the main gate, its ornate ironwork twisted into the shape of the Barron family crest. Solomon pushed it open, and it creaked on hinges that needed oil. One by one, they passed through, stepping onto the public road for the first time as people who owned themselves. Not everyone had chosen to follow Solomon. As his group moved north, he saw others splitting off in different directions. Some headed for the vast swamplands to the east, where generations of escaped slaves had found refuge among cypress trees and alligators. Others moved west, toward towns where they might blend in among free black communities. "The swamp would be safer," muttered Jacob as they walked. "No man can track us there." "We're not hiding," Solomon replied. "We're living." They walked through the night, putting miles between themselves and the burning plantation. When dawn broke, they rested in a small grove of trees, eating the food they'd managed to bring and planning their next steps. Solomon's back still burned with pain from the whipping, but he stood straight as he spoke to the small group. "From here, we split up, travel in twos or threes, less noticeable that way." "Where will we meet again?" asked the woman with the child. "Ohio," said Solomon. "There's a church in Cincinnati with a red door. I'll find you there." They divided the coins from Ambrose's study. Not enough to make anyone rich, but enough to help them on their journey. Then, with quick embraces and whispered good wishes, they separated. Solomon continued north with Jacob and a younger man named David. They traveled by night and slept hidden during the day. They changed their names in each county they passed through. They learned to walk differently, speak differently, to become new men with each sunrise. Weeks later, in a tavern in a northern Georgia county, a group of planters gathered to share news and rumors. They spoke in low voices, glancing over their shoulders despite being among friends. "Heard about Barron Plantation?" asked one, a red-faced man with mutton chop sideburns. The others leaned in. "Burned to the ground," he continued. "Ambrose Barron dead at his own wife's funeral feast. Poisoned, they say." "I heard it was his wife's spirit," whispered another. "Taken revenge for being buried too quick." A third man shook his head. "It was that slave of theirs. The tall one Ambrose gave to his wife as a birthday gift. They say he murdered them both." "Murdered?" The red-faced man looked skeptical. How could a slave murder a plantation master and his wife? The wife fell down the cellar stairs, crushed under her own weight and a pile of sugar barrels. Convenient accident, wasn't it? And the husband, blue-lipped and choking at his own dinner table. They say the slave put peach pit poison in his wine. Silence fell over the table as each man considered this. Finally, the skeptic spoke again. "What was his name?" "This slave?" "Solomon," answered the third man. "They're saying his name from Atlanta to Savannah. Some of the slaves call him a hero. Can you imagine?" In other counties, in field quarters and kitchens, in hidden gatherings and whispered conversations, the story spread faster than the flames had consumed Barron Plantation. It changed with each telling. growing more powerful. They spoke of Euphemia Barron, the fat mistress crushed by her own greed and cruelty. They told of Ambrose Barron, poisoned at his wife's funeral feast, his last sight, the face of the man he thought he owned. And they whispered the name Solomon with something like reverence, a name that was becoming legend. In cramped cabins, mothers told their children, "Remember Solomon, who turned his chains into weapons." In secret meetings, leaders spoke of him as proof that the most powerful could fall, that the most powerless could rise. The truth of what had happened that night would never be fully known. But the story, the legend, served its purpose. It spread like fire through dry cotton, igniting hope where before there had been only resignation. Solomon had become more than a man. He had become a promise that even in a world built to crush them, the oppressed could turn everything upside down. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.